Jacop Rentschler, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to make it after all.
Yeah,
I think we try to meet, for the last couple of years. We try to do it in Philadelphia. We try to meet in Nairobi.
There's a little bit of COVID in between.
Yeah, exactly. But now we're in beautiful Denmark, in beautiful Copenhagen on a sunny morning, I guess. So great to see you again. Like I said on the phone, I wanted to meet you again and kind of have a chat with you. But a proper chat, one-on-one, instead of just in person, instead of having a Zoom call. You're the founder of Zoscales Partners. It's a private equity fund that invests in Africa. And you started the company from scratch. And you've raised Fund 1, you've deployed it, you're raising Fund 2 now. The reason I wanted to speak to you is partly to understand how you went about creating the company, literally from nothing to where you are today, and what you went through in terms of the different steps, as well as maybe if you can share with us some of the challenges and some of the issues you faced along. I mean, I know a lot of people would be interested in hearing a little bit more about the issues you encountered and how you faced them, how you approached them and resolved them, because that's a very common thing for a lot of people starting, well, startups in general, but particularly new funds. And you're in an interesting position because you're not only starting a new fund, but it's an emerging markets fund and a fund also in Africa, which has its own challenges, which we'll be talking about. So without further, I guess, maybe introductions here, tell me a little bit more about what you, first of all, what got you to do this and what kind of background you're coming from. And then I'll tell you some of my questions, ask you some of my questions as well, and go from there.
No, thanks a lot. And I think first and foremost, this is, I'm co-founder, so there's another friend, Ashanafi Alemi, who we did that together. We are two co-founders, and we initially met during business school.
Oh, really?
In Denmark, and many years ago, and became good friends. And then along the way, we are, besides being friends, we also started brainstorming on what to do in the future. And I think the key element here was, if you build a firm or you want to build a firm at some point, I think it's part of your DNA. Ash is a very entrepreneurial person. I think I'm quite an entrepreneurial person, and at some point you just feel that right now it's the right time to actually build your own business. And I think it's also about the people that inspire you as well to build something. And I think one of the people that really inspired me was my grandfather, who had a large architecture firm in the Nordics, and showing us what he's building and what he has built was really inspiring. So we wanted to also build something and make a difference in this world.
So you wanted something tangible, because I think you're coming from an asset management background, right?
Yes.
I mean, you worked for Rothschild prior to that you were UBS and Nordea, if I'm not mistaken. So in fact, that's it's financial services, but that's not typically the background of private equity investors. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that as well. If you can tell me how you went from this to PE in a way.
I think it was more about, I always liked private equity. I think it was an interesting tool to actually balance your portfolio, to increase portfolio efficiency. You always liked that sort of instrument. And when we looked at building a private equity, we wanted to build a private equity firm, but then when we looked at different areas in the world, I mean, Europe is quite competitive, and through Ash, we analyzed Africa a lot, and just realized that there are not so many places there, and there's a lot we can actually improve on the continent. So I think that was the reason why we decided to actually go on that continent and start a private equity firm there.
So your partners, I mean, Ash is you met in your undergraduate program, right? So you were students back then. That will be interesting to a lot of undergrads and MBAs at Wharton, who will be most likely the bulk of the population watching this. Although this will be probably put out there for anybody who would like to see it. So tell us a little bit about how you, maybe when you're thinking this early on in your life about setting up a fund, where do you really start? Like I know you've had a career before you set up the fund, but as you're preparing for this, what are the first things that you have to think about?
So I think that the starting point is really a vision. You need to share a vision together to make this happen. This is extremely important. I think this is the core driver of building a business.
The background of people, you mean?
Just to share, to have the same, to be aligned on the vision together. I think that's very important. And then what we did, obviously we didn't have, like Ash and I didn't have the classical ingredients for building a private equity firm, especially for a private equity firm in Africa. So we analyzed, we did a lot of pre-work. So we talked to consulting firms that worked with private equity firms in Africa. We tried to figure out what it takes to really be successful in Africa. We also had, of course, ideas of what it takes. And then we also looked at our strengths and weaknesses, and we sort of looked at us and said, there's a lot of stuff that is missing. And we tried to reach out to people skills and experience that we wanted to insource through other people. So we went out and looked at, for example, a person that has a full cycle private equity experience, which is now our chairman of the investment committee. We also learned that in Africa, private equity is quite different. So we also knew that we need to sort of work with operating partners, so people who have a lot of operational experience. And then when we built the team, we also believed that it's good to have both a very strong local footprint, but at the same time also international people. So have both angles in one team. That was sort of our philosophy at the beginning, and I think it still is to really have a strong local footprint, to have international backgrounds as well, to have both operational but also financial experience.
So how many partners all in all do we have right now?
At the moment, we have 3 partners.
3 partners.
But we have quite a few people we have operating partners as well, 3. And then we also have people who have quite an active role, like the chairman of the investment committee. We have advisors that support us very intensively. You know, they're advisors through their role. They're shareholders, they're investors, so they're very active support people in our shop.
So what's your advice for a young team trying to start a company that invests in emerging markets, particularly a private equity fund in that context? What do you suggest to them in terms of the choice of partners within this kind of firm?
I think it's a very difficult question, because I think you hear of key man events where people start together and then it doesn't work out along the way. I think a lot of people tell you that friends should never do business. Mm-hmm. I would say if we had not been friends, we would not do business. So I think that element is really key to work with people that you really, really trust. And in our case, I think it was very, very helpful that we were good friends. And then when you look at people you want to sort of integrate into your team, I think the more senior you go, the more careful you need to be to sort of get to know them, see whether you actually align. It's a very difficult task. I mean, you see teams that just carve out of a big shop. I mean, they've been working together for a couple of years. That's probably an easy case. But even there, it doesn't ensure that actually being in this very difficult environment that you actually also work together quite well. So in a big firm, everything is organized. And then when you start your own firm, there's a lot of challenges to pump up that you don't expect, and you go through very difficult cycles. And if you're not a true team and honest to each other, supporting each other, it's difficult.
I've worked over the years with a few emerging managers who always mention the same challenges as we start working together, in the sense that you really have to think about the team members, the profiles, but also a lot of things that they thought would happen didn't necessarily happen the way they thought it would happen. It's always more challenging than they originally planned it to be. And so perhaps what I want to start on is the time it took for you to build this. So I know your first closing, if I'm not mistaken, was in 2017, right?
Yeah.
For the first fund. But when did you set up the company, the first entity?
So I think we officially registered our company in May 2014.
2014.
So that's sort of the official start. But the official start doesn't mean that we started fundraising. We had a pitch book and everything ready. That's quite the opposite. So there's a lot of pre-work that started then. We started to look at the team members, find some team members, at least look out and search for people who want to support us.
You mean partners or actually employees?
No, like also like the chairman of the IC, like advisors, operating partners. So that's we knew that will take quite some time, and also learn about the market and talk to a lot of people.
Okay.
Learn about failures of others, and so that took quite some time, and obviously also took a lot of time to work on a business plan, figure out how do you finance this whole setup until you reach first close.
So if you're, talking to someone and trying to advise them on how to start, where do you advise them to start? Is it the business plan? Is it going out there and talking to, like you just mentioned, talking to people in the market, kind of gathering almost information and knowledge? Is it more about creating the right pitch? It kind of all goes together, no doubt. But where do you really start? Like almost the step 1, step 2, step 3, that usually...
I think it's difficult.
It's tricky.
It's probably difficult to say. I would rather think of a balanced scorecard concept, where you have different projects in parallel that work, because they're interconnected as well. So you may start with a deck that you think is well thought through, and then you have a couple of investor meetings and you've realized, oh, that's actually not so clear. So there's a lot of different pockets that you need to work on at the same time. Probably the most important advice is to be ready to face challenges. I think what we did early on is we discussed the worst case scenario, kind of, because I think when you're ready to actually accept the worst case scenario, it's extremely powerful.
What was the worst case scenario in your case?
The worst case scenario was actually this whole thing doesn't work, and we'll never make it, and are we fine with that?
Were you close to that at times? Were you close to giving up?
We had times where almost of bankruptcy, right?
Okay,
so I didn't have any money anymore, and so I think be comfortable with the worst case, and maybe you can also have another level that is like a difficult case, another worst case, and then also test your business plan, test your deck, and talk to a lot of people. I think that's really the key advice. Talk to a lot of people. I think that's extremely... And talk to a lot of people who have been in the market, talk to a lot of people who have built their own investment team, investment firm, also very senior people. They're often quite happy to help.
On that point, when you're trying to reach out to people, how easy was it? Were people generally receptive to you, or were there sometimes where you were not getting anywhere as well? Because that's something that people complain about as well. No matter how senior they are, how experienced and how much connections they have in the market, for some reasons, it doesn't always work out that way.
I think we were extremely lucky. Cold calling people is not easy, right?
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, we were extremely lucky. Of course, some people we approached and never got back to us, but I think our hit ratio was quite high. And we were analyzing a little bit why was that the case. And I think you will be laughing now, but we approached two guys. They were both ex-partners from a big global private equity fund. And before we actually sent the button to send this email, we discussed this email like for 1.5 days. Even with friends checking, is that really like
the wording of the email?
The wording of the email, and keep it short, concise. I think that played off well. And we were surprised how many people from big shops actually got back to us and thought, okay, this is actually pretty interesting, cool. Let us help you guys. We can have a coffee.
So I may be going to ask you a very basic question. So you email people, you call them. How did you get these introductions to some of these? Are they investors? You mean they're LPs? There may be other people who have invested as GPs as well. How did you get these introductions, whether within your circle of friends? And was it maybe the kind of connections you had made at Rothschild and UBS before, or was it... maybe it had nothing to do with that. I don't know. You tell me.
No, but I think it's an interesting point, because of course it helps to work for a firm that people know in the investment space. But of course, also through your career, you get to know quite a bunch of people that are relevant. So and you know, when you look close, you always find somebody to connect to another person. So I think it's going through your own network. Of course, having worked for a firm that people know is helpful, but not always. I mean, we also approach people that, you know, there were no links, and we just approach them.
On the setup of the firm, I know you. Well, maybe let's talk a little bit about how you set this up. I know it came in a little bit later, like most funds usually you go through starting the business, thinking about what you want to do. But the legal setup is something of interest personally to me and to a lot of people out there. I understand that you set up the company. The fund. Your jurisdiction of choice was Mauritius. Yet, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of your investors, of your LPs, are European. Are they all European, or are there anyone who's not a European at the moment?
Most of them are European. There's one entity that's not European. Yeah.
Okay. Any American entities?
Yeah.
There are some American entities. Okay. And why Mauritius? Maybe not Luxembourg. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because that's a common question. Jurisdiction is always a question that comes up early on, and where to set up.
So that's a very interesting question, because when you work with the big firms, I mean, you don't think about fund domicile. It just continue and it's also back a middle office question. I think it's an interesting question that we try to solve through talking to our LPs, find out which domicile works for all of them, and we started out in Denmark actually, because we thought that could actually make sense, because there's a lot of private investors from here, commercial investors. But then we figured out that actually for some LPs it doesn't work if it's domiciled in Denmark.
Oh, you mean you started like the original plan was to have the domicile in Denmark?
Yeah.
Was that your thinking, or was that legal advice that you got?
That was a combination, I think, both legal advice and also our thinking, because we thought that could make sense. But then we realized that, especially talking to international lawyers, that this is actually was not really the right setup for a global investor base. Okay. So we chose Mauritius because that's a domicile where a lot of funds are investing in Africa. I think that was one driver, that proof of concept sort of thinking. But then we also realized that some potential LPs, they required Mauritius as a domicile for us.
Let me take a second and ask you about Denmark, because you mentioned Denmark and asking about having thought about setting up in Denmark, which is very unusual for funds for emerging markets. I mean, partly maybe because you're part Danish. I mean, you're Swiss Danish. Is that why you were thinking of that, or is there a reason, like why Denmark of all places? Because I know you live in Switzerland and you were looking to invest in Africa. So how did the Denmark part? Although we're in Denmark today, but I mean, what was the reason at the time?
So I think Zoscales is born in Denmark. Right?
Okay.
I'm half Danish. Ash, the other co-founder, is Ethiopian of origin, but he's also Danish now. And we have a lot of investors from here. So we thought that being next door would make sense from a domicile point of view. But then we realized for a more international crowd, because we also have to look into the long term, it didn't make much of sense. So it was more like that. There is a couple of there's Danish investors that invest through Danish Danish structures, but it was maybe not the best thing for some international investors.
Okay, you mentioned some of the shareholders. If I heard you right, or maybe was it the LPs that were predominantly Danish? Was it or both maybe?
Yeah.
Is it that the bulk of the shareholders in your management company are Danish citizens as well?
They're actually most of them are Danish. There's one operating partner. He's an Ethiopian shareholder. It's obviously Ash and me who are the main shareholders. But then we have also 3 shareholders from Denmark, who all have quite an active role actually in our business.
You know, actually, since we're talking about the management firm and the shareholders and stuff, maybe we can take a second to talk a little about the legal structure of a private equity fund, a simple one, which is, tell me a little bit what kind of legal structure you have. I mean, typically you have a fund, and that's where the LPs will place their money. You've got the GP, essentially, which is a separate legal entity. And then you've got what's typically called an advisory firm or the management firm, which is really where your money is placed and your shareholders, your fellow shareholders have their money placed, which is essentially the main entity that we're calling Zoscales at that point, and then that's going to manage all the funds. Is this really the structure you have typically? I mean, not typically, but in this case, is this what you have?
That's exactly what we have, and I think it's pretty common. So I think starting with the management company or the advisory firm, that's where the shareholders are, and then that entity actually advises the fund or the GP. And I think the shareholders in the management company are sometimes mistaken by the shareholders of the partnership, right, of the fund. But then as you rightly explained, then you have the fund and the GP that is domiciled in our case in Mauritius, and that's where the investors invest in.
Okay. A question off of what you just mentioned here on Mauritius and all. I noticed that the second fund is going to be based in Luxembourg. Can you tell us a little bit why you're changing jurisdictions now?
I think for us it was so for the long run, we are also learning along the way, right? And I think for us, we decided to relocate to Luxembourg simply because there is quite a few family offices typically that are more used to structures in Luxembourg. And we believe that if you redomicile, it's a big work. We'd rather do it to a place where we don't have to redomicile again. And I mean, I've been working with Luxembourg for many years. There's a lot of private equity funds domiciled in Luxembourg. So it's a structure, it's a domicile that we believe really works as proof of concept. It's a good service you get, and for us it's also coming from there are also compliance issues in the private equity space. We have some quite traumatic events in emerging markets, as you also know. So for us, the whole compliance aspect is also extremely important, and I think we believe that Luxembourg they have a very good compliance setup. We as a firm have actually decided to outsource compliance. To make it really compliant, right? So we have objective compliance outsourced that works on.
And how do you do that? I mean, is it through the fund administrator? If we can talk a little bit about this.
That's a legal firm. Okay. It's not the fund administrator; it's a legal firm that takes that task.
Okay. I mean, you're talking about compliance vis-a-vis the regulator.
It's both, right? It's both. Okay. It's the fund, but it's also general operations of the Zoscales Partners.
Like the KYCs and the AMLs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, what was so if you were to tell someone who's starting a new fund, a first-time manager, would you recommend them that they start with the Luxembourg, given the background you have, versus a Mauritius? I know Mauritius is a very common,
I think,
jurisdiction for Africa, but.
I think that really depends. I think there I would advise to talk to global lawyers. I would advise to also talk to LPs or limited partners, especially large and experienced limited partners, what their view is. Because once you have decided on a domicile, you want to stay in that particular domicile.
I can imagine.
And I think, our choice was now Luxembourg for the future. I'm sure there are other domiciles that make equal good sense.
On the question of lawyers, did you bring them really early on in the process of you starting this firm? Like when you set up in 2014, I would imagine lawyers were involved. But when do you really engage lawyers? Because you must have started a little bit earlier than 2014 thinking about this and maybe setting it up in some form or shape, maybe building the business plan and stuff. When did you actually start really working on this project? Was it 2013, 2012? When was that exactly?
So I think we started thinking about it in 2012, maybe end of fall or something, 2012. And in our case, I think what was really, really important is the network we also had. I mean, we knew good lawyers. There's a lot of lawyers who are friends as well at the same time, so who could give us objective advice. And I think that helped a lot because it's quite a jungle. So you need to work with experts. So that helped, to give us inputs on structures, on domicile discussions, and then I think so that's 2012. And then I think Of course, we were all working still full time, so there was a bit of a side idea. And then in 2014, we really officially started to engage with lawyer friends first. And then at some point it was clear that, when we had an idea of the structure, we knew that somebody professionally have to set it up. And we first engaged with a Danish law firm, where we then realized that that's the wrong setup for us. And then we decided to go with a global firm.
Okay.
But that was quite later on. It was, maybe a year before first close or something like that.
So that would be like 2016.
16 or so, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think of course, then you have the issue of, the lawyers are expensive.
Right.
How do you actually finance that? So either you finance it directly through, along the way, or you find a law firm that is actually happy to take a bit of risk and where payment happens at first close.
Oh, so there's that option is out there for emerging market funds.
I think it's some do it. Our law firm did it, which was great.
Okay.
It was great help because of course the budget is super tight, as you can imagine, and we managed to sort of negotiate an arrangement where payment happens after first close.
And did they kind of require did they study your profile, do some due diligence on you of some sort to kind of trust you with paying you later?
We didn't know them, We didn't know them, so I think probably they did. Probably also did reference checks. I mean, we also already had some investors committed.
Okay.
So they probably cross-checked, but they took a bit of risk because it's Africa. It's it's a first-time fund. There was a first-time fund.
Did you ask them, or did they suggest that to you? How did it happen?
Oh, we asked them.
You asked them.
I think we asked them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
On that topic, I mean, the whole idea of needing money, because all this stuff is expensive setting up, and having the attorneys, even maybe paying yourself to survive for what is effectively 3 years between the 2014 when you left your job at Rothschild Bank, and then by the time you set up, when you closed the first, when you did the first closing with Fund One. During those 3 years, how did you manage to cover your expenses? Now, we've talked about you having shareholders, so clearly there was some capital injection into your management firm, if I heard you right. But was that the only source of money to bridge that period? So savings is one, I understand. Capital injections into the GP or actually the management firm. But did you take some kind of bridge financing facility or like any kind of, any of that happen?
So I think first of all, I would say it's much more expensive than you anticipate.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So when you do a business plan, always add at least the standard deviation of 1 to 2 years. Because you have external factor that can influence your timing. You can have unexpected things that just maybe doesn't work with some of the people you plan to work with. So I think it takes longer than you anticipate. I think that's super important. And then also in terms of budgeting, that then connects to the budget. It's much more important than much more expensive than you anticipate. So what we did is, of course, own saving. We used all our money to set it up, and then luckily we also could inspire our shareholders to make capital contributions. That was very important. I think without them, it would not have worked. And then we also looked into programs to actually get loans or bridge loans. So we found a mechanism from the United Nations that you could apply for. It's called a startup loan. So if the fund fails, it's sort of you don't have to pay it back.
It's forgiven?
It's forgiven. If you close, then you pay it back. And it was at 0 interest. So that was a fantastic loan. And I think without that loan, for example, and we are very thankful for their support, we probably wouldn't have done it. Without the shareholders, without the loan, I don't think we could have reached the finish line.
Interesting. Where would you go for these types of financing?
It's a very good question. I mean, friends and family, obviously, but I think we didn't want to do that. So it's very difficult because I mean
but like the bridge loan and stuff,
the bridge loan facility. So
that facility, where would you go for? I mean,
it was a friend.
I was not aware that that program existed, frankly.
Yeah.
And I mean, I live in this world, so I as they say, like I follow pretty much everything that happens in the PE world, and I'm not sure if there's a place where you can go and kind of point to where there are a few options for bridge loans in emerging markets. I mean, we're talking emerging markets, of course, because there's a lot of bridging finance. I mean, there's a lot of bridging facilities elsewhere. But when you're talking about Africa, where would you go for a bridge facility, whether it's a loan or a grant or something like that? I would imagine the DFIs, but you tell me a little bit. Where did you start looking?
I mean, it's a really good question, and I think that particular program from the United Nations, I didn't know of it either. It was a friend of ours who gave us a hint, and I think my advice here would be obviously when you invest in Africa. I mean, there's a lot of DFIs who invest in Africa, and I would suggest to talk to them. They have sometimes great programs to support you, and how to get to these programs, it's a difficult one. I think it's, I don't know whether you can find them through searches. It's for us, it was through our network, and it's again to go back to the point of talking to many people, because there's always some piece of advice that pump up that all of a sudden turn out relevant.
So is it fair to say that it was almost like by chance that you stumbled?
Definitely.
You basically came across this. Interesting. So we talked about the way you used this loan and how you had some injection of capital into the management company and how you used some of your savings. And this is very relevant to anybody who's starting a new fund. But no matter how much money you get, you got to be kind of strategic about where you spend that money. So we know about consultants and attorneys, for instance. In this case, you were able to defer payment until first closing. Now, what about other consultants? Were you able to do the same with them, or was it a little bit harder to do?
So I think, the legal fees were the biggest chunk, the biggest part for us. So that was important. But there are advisors that you need to pay on the way. So such as so we were working on a deal, for example, prior to first close, and due diligence costs we sort of had to take on our own. And there are other advisors that you sometimes have to pay, like tax advice we had to pay, or set up the company, our own company we had to pay.
The management firm.
The management firm. So there are costs that you have to actually, and the team obviously. So the team is the biggest cost.
So you hired people before first close, essentially.
Obviously,
you started hiring people.
Obviously, it's there's something called chicken and egg. I'm sure everybody has heard about it. It's really true. I mean, some people tell you, but why don't you wait with the team until you have the capital, and the other way around. So for us, it was very, very difficult to pitch the story with no team, because especially commercial investors, they want to see how are you going to manage your idea, and there it's important for us. It was important to have maybe not the entire team ready, but at least some kind of team of shape ready before you reach first close.
So we're talking about the cost of lawyers and perhaps other consultants as well, and then there's some salaries that you had to spend some money on originally. And how did you pay yourselves? And by the way, can I ask you a personal question? I know you're married now, and Ash is married, and you have kids. At the time, did you have families? Because I can imagine it was tricky.
Yeah, that was a bit lucky. So our fixed cost level was pretty low. So we had almost a student life again.
I see.
Which was quite interesting, because you come from a good job, a well-paid job, to almost nothing. It's a healthy exercise, I would say, and it works. It works quite well, because if you have a common goal and then the shared vision, I think you do whatever it takes. But I think that one was important to have quite a flexible fixed cost environment. So I didn't have big family or private schools to be paid and so on, because that can be quite an expensive part of your income. So we could put our incomes pretty low. We could actually invest whatever we don't have to pay us. We could invest in other people. I think that was very, very important. So keep a very, very tight budget is key, especially because it can take longer. And another element we also realized, so we also talked to other big private equity funds, and some of the founders told us that, and they're all our godfathers and LPs and advisors, and they, for example, told us that, we asked them, how did you do it? I mean, they're multi-billion-dollar platforms, right? And some of them told us, look, we gave the first employees no salary, or almost no salary. I was a little bit like, wow, that sounds pretty good, because that, you know, keeps the budget low. But the thing was that this is a long-term journey, and if you want to identify the people who are really burning for this, then it's about the future growth, right? It's about the perspectives. And if you hire people that want to get a very high base right now and here, it's a bit the wrong mindset, especially at the early stage. I mean, at some point now we've been there for a couple of years now. Things change, right? So we of course want to pay you know, fair market salaries, but at the beginning that was key. Yeah, we had flexible setups. We could pay ourselves almost nothing. We could live like students, and we could make sure that people who joined us early on didn't require big you know, industry standard salaries.
Okay. Did you, I don't know if you can speak to that or not, but when you're setting up these salary packages to the people who are joining you, were you mixing up a little bit of base with some equity element early on? Is that fair to say that this is something that you did?
I think our philosophy is we learn also from the big funds, and I think one example I would like to highlight is EQT. So we have connections to how they build it, and I think what they did impressively right was to really share the upside.
Okay.
And that can be through carry, that can be through shares, the management firm, and we actually share that vision, because I think if people can share the upside, it's another team dynamic that you actually create, another culture you create. We did the same, so we sort of integrated that also in our firm, that, you know, to make sure that people have an okay base, but it's more about building upside together. And you know, we for example share carry with the entire firm. It's not only the partners. I think that's important, and also, you know, we share salary increases whenever we grow. So whenever we grow the asset base, we share that. So everybody's lifted. Yeah, we make sure that the growth is really, everybody's participating on the growth. I think that's very, very important.
So we touched on these various topics. I want to get to the part where everybody struggles, which is fundraising. That is the big question. How do you start fundraising, and where do you go? I know you have a network. I know you met people along the way. You already mentioned that through your connection, through cold calls, through trying different things. But I mean, people try conferences. I know that we've met at a conference. So essentially, that was one way to meet others. And but where do you start thinking about how to target the right profile for you? Because not every LP may be willing to put money in your strategy, geography, fund size, your team profile, etc. How did you go about it? Was it at first more of a hit or miss kind of thing, or was there like a really laid out kind of detailed strategy? I'd love to hear about that if possible.
So in our case, it was a bit it was a bit challenging, I would say, at the beginning, because, you know, we are not like a bunch of 10, 15 people carved out from a big PE firm with 15 years of track record in exactly the same field that we're going to operate later on. So for us, it was a bit different. So we had to, you know, we had some experience obviously, and also then integrating more people. You know, the track record could be, you know, grew with additional team members. But I think for us, what the biggest challenge was that we had a big, through previous work, we had a big network into investors, right? But then the surprising aspect was that nobody was really interested in what we were doing, at least not the ones we thought would obviously be our first investors. And then we had to be creative, right? So we had to, you know, find other sources of, you know, people who could connect us, who could help us. So how we did it, obviously we went to DFIs. I think that was really, really key. They're very helpful in the process. But at the same time, we always wanted to be also commercial. So we wanted to attract, commercial capital to our firm. How did you do that? I think it's a bit of a trial and error. You should always be systematic about your fundraising, but I think you should really always expect also the unexpected, because so all the investors from the commercial side were new investors. Like there's
new
no
as in like you had never met them before?
Never met before.
Never had any interaction with
Never met before in the previous career. Of course, obviously some connections came through the network.
Okay.
So and then what we learned, we learned a concept called look close. So you get a bunch of millions, and then you hold and say, okay, how can we get the next 10, 20 millions? And then we always found out that it's actually pretty good to go look close and look to the people you already have on board and ask them, isn't there one more investor you could think of, or a family office or a connection? So to grow from the core, that was really key. We're not really big fans of calling investors. I personally never liked that. We always prefer to have a link, because it's quite a personal investment. I mean, you invest in a team,
absolutely.
Right? You invest in the people. So for us to have a link to these investors was very important.
Some
and
introduction.
Yeah.
Interesting. And did you do any? Did you use placement agents?
We tried, and maybe before that, one thing I would like to mention as well. What we also did is, when we were ready with the idea, when we were ready with the deck, when we were ready with the sort of a little team, we tried to pitch our case to people who come from the investment world. So we pitched it to partners from big funds. And the reason why we did that is we wanted to get a proof of concept. So if these guys who have done private equity for many, many years are willing to invest in our fund, we thought that's a pretty strong proof of concept. So we did that, and for some it actually worked. So that was a starting point. And once we had a couple of ex-partners or partners from big funds, then we could really start off the ground. And that was a good starting point to also then work with more DFIs, because DFIs also want to see traction. And then we were thinking about using placement agents. The problem here is, it was not a no-brainer for them. I mean, we didn't have a 15-year track record on the market. The team was more or less new. Obviously, Ash and I have known each other for many years. That helped a lot. But it was not a no-brainer for using a placement agent. And also another problem is, I mean, we were raising a $75 million fund, where a placement agent, especially the international ones, they want to have a certain allocation, and we could not provide that. But we use placement, quote-unquote placement agent, in the sense, friends and family. I mean, we all know people in the financial industry. They have maybe met the family office that was interested in the market. So, and that actually really helped as well.
I see. So really used the connection. Did you maybe compensate them in some shape at some point? Maybe, was it more like them doing it because they felt like helping? Was it? The biggest compensation we did was a closing party with our friends. I got you.
and which was really, really cool. And friends, they never ask for money. I mean, that was just, they were happy to help.
Would you generally recommend placement agents? I mean, I know in that context, I'm not saying in general, but I'm talking specifically for a first-time fund targeting essentially first-time team targeting an emerging market. Is this something you'd recommend, using a placement agent?
So I've heard other funds who did that, and I think it has an advantage when you raise a first-time fund that has a certain size. I think 75 was too small to work with. But if you have a certain size, it's a good idea, because it can really help you for Fund 2 and beyond. I think it's a good idea. If you find a placement agent that and maybe you can even engage them, give them a bit of a stake in your firm, or besides the placement agreements, that could be interesting. But I think that requires that you know them. They trust you. They believe in the team. They believe in the story. I've seen examples where that worked quite well, but they engage them also. They are shareholders in the firm as well.
I see. On the mix of LPs, of investors that you dealt with, that you eventually brought on to your fund, I would imagine there's a mix of DFIs clearly and commercial investors like individuals, maybe some family. I don't know exactly the profile of the commercial investors you have. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, how is it split? Is it predominantly DFIs or predominantly commercial investors?
So in our case, it's 50% DFIs roughly in terms of size, and in terms of size also 50% commercial investors. And the DFIs are, I mean, they're publicly known. You know, the Danish one, IFU, IFC, FMO, BioInvest, and DGGF.
DGDF, do you mean the
Dutch Good Growth Fund? Yeah. And then we have private investors or family office that are, most of them are domiciled in Denmark. And now we want to grow outside Denmark. You know, people like, I mean, normally you don't mention names, actually, they prefer to be, not to be mentioned, but you know, one person I can mention is for example, Kasper Kirk Johansen, who is the chairman of Kirk Capital. It's a Danish multifamily office. That's typically a family office or a private individual that you meet, who like the idea, who likes the idea, who supports you, and then of course also generates traction, right? Because then it helps that, you know, another family office is not the only family office that invest, and it's also a little bit like proof of concept in the sense we're not the only one backing these guys, so that's super helpful. But what we also did on the private individual side, we have quite a lot of investors with relevant backgrounds. So we have quite a couple of private equity partners or founders of large private equity funds. We have chairman of big conglomerates, big companies. And that's interesting because they have a bit of an entrepreneurial DNA. They like this idea that people start something. But the other element which is really important is also, besides the capital they bring to you, they're really, really interesting people. I mean, you can talk to them, you can tap into their brains. It's a 10 minutes phone call to talk about a potential case where they can tell you, look, these and these things you need to watch out for. So I think building your LP base is very, very key. I mean, it's really not only about the capital. It's also about the crowd you can actually get around you, and the private side or the commercial side has been extremely helpful for us. But at the same time, also the DFI space has been extremely helpful because, you know, they've done private equity funds in Africa for so many years. They have technical assistance. They support you. They are also a bit of proof of concept or quality stamped, and again for the commercial side, because for example in Denmark there were quite a few family offices that I think invested in us because IFU was invested in us. I think that really helped us because, you know, for them we were a small fund. To do the whole legal work was too much for them for such a small allocation. I think that really helped, and I think that's the role we appreciate with the DFIs, so to become sort of the proof of concept, quality stamp institution, and really mobilizing commercial capital. That worked quite well. Yeah.
You mentioned technical assistance. Sorry. Could you really elaborate on that, because this is important for people to know what it really means, especially if they're targeting DFIs as investors. And then I'm going to ask you how you balance bringing in DFIs and commercial players, but we'll get into that in a second.
So the first question, the technical assistance, that's super helpful in almost any stage of your firm, because at the very beginning there's you know, you have training, you need to integrate an ESG manager, for example, ESG policies, etc., which is key for us. I mean, for all investment firm, but in particular in Africa. And you know, you get advice. They support you. They train you. They also, along the way, then with some DFIs, they also supported us on financing systems, for example, or co-financing systems. Train portfolio companies, for example. So this is really helpful. And you know, you share the cost as well. So that's also helpful. And you know, the cost is always an element that is important because we are a small fund. The budget is always super tight, and if you can help each other a bit, that's helpful. Then to your second point.
On that first point, the technical assistance part, you mentioned that they were able to help you with ESG policy, for instance, setting up your ESG policy or training you on ESG topics or giving you maybe supporting you on specific training for portfolio companies. Are you able to speak to specific names of DFIs that did that for you on maybe either the names of the DFIs or the programs?
I can give you some examples. So, for example, through DGGF or Dutch Good Growth Fund or Triple Jump, they helped us.
Triple Jump is the entity that manages the DGGF.
Exactly. Right. So they helped us, for example, set up the whole ESG process, policy, etc., and also train the people. And they had a partnership with PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Okay, interesting. Well firm.
You know well as well. So they came to Addis actually, trained the team and helped us establish policies. That was, for example, an early example. We had other example with the IFC. We worked quite closely with them on, for example, on systems, but also on some portfolio aspects.
Systems and like back office systems, like
exactly, like portfolio management systems,
the reporting system,
exactly.
The accounting systems, all that. Okay.
And then BioInvest, for example, the Belgium DFI also helped us on ESG aspects. An example is, for example, train the portfolio company, C-level management together, you know, where we shared the costs. So that was.
So they train them on how to implement ESG policies.
Exactly. I mean, so we do that all the time, right? Okay. There's a lot of training when you do investing, but you sort of also sometimes integrate or add external advisors, professional ESG professionals, to support the training.
And this technical assistant that comes before you have the DFIs on board and or committed at least to you, or could it happen anytime with? Tell me a little bit. Do they have to be committed to your fund first to help you, or are these programs separate from the commitments they make?
It's pretty much when they're committed, at least sort of the early stage commitments. But the big work we did together was after first close.
Okay. And when you brought in, so going back to my second question, I know we went off on a small, long discussion of the technical assistance part, but the second question I had on these topics is, when you set up your plan to go after commercial investors and DFIs, and by the way, having a mix is always healthy and essentially liked by both types of investors. First of all, which is the faster type of investor to close? I would imagine commercial investors are faster to commit and close. But then a lot of commercial investors want to see DFIs involved or anchoring your fund. And so how does that dynamic play out? Like who signs first, who commits first at least? And do you start with a DFI? You say, I have some DFIs committed, and then that help with the commercial? Was it the other way around? Like, tell me a little bit about that.
It was in our case, it was almost the other way around. So we had a couple of private investors first to start mobilizing DFIs. But I think my advice here would be to focus on both, because I think both are very helpful. In terms of speed, obviously some family office, they have a very, very fast process. You know, they can sort of, especially if it's a smaller fund, sometimes they can just sign it off much more quickly. Whereas DFIs have a longer process. It takes a bit longer, but also come with
that's usually
the
tickets. Feedback. That's the feedback I get. Yeah. So what you're recommending, if I'm hearing you right, is it almost like the fundraising strategy should have a dual or two elements to it. One, which is to pursue DFIs irrespective of time. And then the other one is to pursue all the different commercial players. Now, when I say commercial, you're involving family offices, individuals, pension funds, maybe in that, we're talking about the whole suite of different allocators that are out there. And so where did you find your sweet spot, given that it's a $75 million fund? Was it more on the family office and individuals, or was it more on the pension fund, insurance companies, that kind of stuff? I would imagine insurance companies would be too big for this kind of fund.
And also pension funds. Yeah. So I think number one is again really understand your product, and then see where there's an obvious fit. So the pension fund space we tried a little bit, but we were too small, and a lot of institutional investors, they don't do first-time funds. So that we realized quickly. DFIs is an obvious target, obvious partners to work with. Then I think it's also a bit. I mean, I think private investors are a good space as well, because I mean, there can be private investors that are also almost family office.
As in like individuals, you mean?
Private individuals, yeah. And you know, they can quickly allocate a sizable commitment.
Let me ask you on the timing of all these different investors when you're bringing them on. Some are faster, so how many closings did you have? I mean, I know it's a $75 million fund. That's what it ended up being in total. But did you have just one closing and waited for everybody to commit together and did one or two closings maybe, like, or did you break it up into multiple closings as money came in? What happened?
I think compared to let's say more established markets, you would probably see several closings often, especially in the first fund. So first of all, first close probably takes longer than you anticipate, number one. Number two, what is really helpful is to have several closings also because you just raise the asset base, right? So because you have a pipeline of potential deals, and you know, the larger the commitment level, the better, the more you can allocate in some of the deals. So I think several closing is definitely something that I would suggest, unless you have a first close and incredible momentum and you can do final close shortly after. Realistically, for a first-time fund, I would say it's recommendable to do several closings. Now you have to, of course, watch out because each closing is also is quite expensive. So you have to do a cost-benefit analysis of that. If it's a small amount, I would not recommend to do an intermediary closing. But you know, if the size is good, and you know, it helps.
And for the people watching, when we say closing, that means your LP or the LP to be essentially. When you say closing, that means they've signed the LPA, they've signed all the
they've signed the subscription agreement. They're on board.
So they're fully on board essentially. That's what
and they also start actually contributing financially, so they start paying management fee.
Okay, excellent. On the topic of multiple closings, the last closing, for instance, that you had, was it more larger players that came in later in the game? If you can give me, because I know from knowing this industry that usually the DFIs take some time, and they were there DFIs in the last closing first. So can you speak to that? Maybe? Are you allowed to say names and stuff?
So in our case, you know, it's interesting. As a first close is such a key event because there's a lot of people that maybe don't believe in the concept. They want to check it out. But I think first close is a key achievement you need to get to. Now, when you have a first close, which in our case was pretty much half of the fund size, a bit lower, it mobilized further capital. So we had a bunch of family offices that just came off the first close because then they saw, okay, this is actually for real. And we also had two DFIs that came off the first close. We have known them for some time, but very, very happy to also integrate them after first close. And then we even had further investors who wanted to come in, but we actually couldn't take them because there was one particular large foundation from the US that, you know, their requirement didn't fit our fund size. So we had a soft level at 60. Initially we wanted, you know, there was the together with our investors we agreed to close at 60. But then, because there was more interest, there were more investors coming, we renegotiated the hard cap at 75.
With the existing LPs?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, two DFIs came later and 3 DFIs came at the beginning.
I see. Who were the one that came? Are you able to say the names for the ones
So
that
the
came?
first close
and the last
DFIs were IFU, FMO, and DGGF for triple jump, and then IFC and BioInvest came after first close.
So they came in the last close. So
Yeah.
basically the very. So you had
They were the last. They were the last two investors
last
joining
one.
us. Yeah.
Interesting. So you had 3 DFIs in the very first close and 2 DFIs in the very last close.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk a little about pipelines. I know we. You mentioned the chicken and the egg situation a lot of times with raising a first-time fund, particularly in emerging market, particularly in Africa in many ways. So when you're talking to LPs, they want to see some kind of pipeline, meaning a list of potential companies that you're going to be investing in, perhaps companies you've talked to, had extensive conversations with about potentially placing money with them and so on. First of all, how early did you start building that pipeline and thinking about it? And what did you tell the companies? Because you didn't have money early on. So what did you tell the companies that you're about to invest in or that you're thinking of investing? And what did you tell the LPs? That's a conversation that I'd love to hear about.
This was very challenging for us. And the way we did it is first we established an advisory firm in the region we want to invest in. Yeah. And we almost
another one from the one that you set up from the management firm.
Exactly.
That's the traditional
consulting firm.
So it's just a consulting
totally
firm
separate
in
entity.
Africa.
And the reason why we did that is first of all we wanted to get closer to companies. We gave free advice.
Okay.
So and thereby we also started to be able to build a pipeline, and we are operating in a market where private equity is not super well known. It's pretty new to a lot of good businesses, and that helped us a little bit, to get to know them better, understand their challenges even better. I mean, we understand their challenges also through our operating partners that who were operating in local businesses, but it really helped to sort of build a pipeline. That was number one. The number two is of course the challenge of keeping the relationship warm without having the capital, right? There are funds that have enough capital at the beginning to actually warehouse a deal, for example. So they invest in the company already with some friends and family money.
Let's take a second to explain what warehousing deals is essentially in this context.
Yeah. So warehousing means that you have capital that you secure outside your fund or before your fund to actually invest into a company that you then actually put into your fund. So it's sort of
so a deal before the fund is closed,
before
you get your first closing.
Exactly.
You kind of you transact the deal, you put it on the side until the fund is ready, and then you move it to the fund.
Exactly.
Okay. Did you do that yourself?
No, we couldn't. We didn't have enough capital. It would be, I think, it would be a very good idea. It shows a little bit that we can show how you originate deals, how you actually manage them.
You mean for people setting up funds? Would
exactly. So
to have a
it doesn't need to be a big deal, really. So it can be a pretty small deal that still fits into your strategy. We didn't do that. I don't think we would have had enough capital, but we did it through a sort of a consulting business. Now the challenge, of course, comes to keep the relationship warm, because they get excited, they think it's a great idea, it's a good team, they want to work together, they want to start together, and yet you have to still work on the first close. So that's a bit of a challenge. Can you really keep the pipeline live? And I think and there it's just be fair and transparent. I think don't overpromise. I think you just need to explain them also that it's gonna take some time, and once we're done, we can really work together.
One last question on pipelines before we move to other topics. What level of where were you in the conversation essentially when you were talking to these companies? Did you kind of do any diligence on them, or was it just simply conversations about what kind of money they need, for what purpose? Tell me a little bit about that, because there are different types of pipelines out there for various types of firms, and I've seen that over the years, and it's drastically different in terms of the stage where the conversation is at.
So we work with different stages.
Okay.
Right? We had stages that were just, a good network. They know us, we talk to each other, we understand the strategy, the business plan, etc. But there were also stages where we actually agreed to work together. So, and on that stage, we did due diligence, financial due diligence, legal due diligence, maybe even commercial due diligence. So that level was really quite concrete. Mm-hmm. So, we obviously were not in the position to sign a legal document, a committing document, because the legal entity or the fund is not established.
Like a letter of intent or something?
That you could, that we also didn't do yet, because of the timing, right? And also, in terms of, so what's the counterparty? Yeah. So I think it's to an extent where you show them you mean it, because you engage in costs, you start due diligence, external due diligence, and then of course also where you have visibility when first close happens. So the closer you get to first close, obviously the more you can proceed.
What was the incentive of these companies to talk to you, knowing that you didn't have a fund yet? Because they could have gone to a more established, at the time, private equity fund. Albeit in Africa, we both know that it maybe sometimes it's not easy to come across capital in many places. But what made them really spend the time to do a diligence with you on their assets and let you come and look at their information and so on, when in fact you hadn't closed yet? So what do you say to these companies? Like, how do you market it to them? Not that you're misleading, but how are you really presenting yourself to get to that level of access?
I think it's really stay at your core. When we approach a business, we show them, we explain them our culture, we explain them, our value add to their business, and in the end of the day, it's a relationship, it's a partnership you try to build. So it's a lot about the people, and if you convince an owner of a successful business to partner with you, he's fine, or sometimes, or she's fine waiting for another year to actually really start together. And along the way, you discuss things, and it doesn't mean that you cannot help them, assist them before you actually start working together.
So we've talked about a number of things here. What I'd love to hear from you is, I'm sure you've mentioned a lot of issues, that both successes and some challenge and so on. Can you point out a few instances where things went spectacularly
wrong?
Or maybe not spectacular, but at least something that went didn't go as expected. Maybe think of like things you can share with the people who are going to be watching this. Maybe something they can learn from. Let's start maybe with fundraising. Did something go wrong in fundraising that you could point to that people can learn from?
I think fundraising is, we had a lot of learnings, obviously. In fundraising, I think some learnings I can think of is, for example, really read the potential investors well, because some people tell you, it's very interesting, but you never get the ball rolling. Then also when you get commitments, watch out how reliable are these commitments. So we had a very big commitment, almost it would have been the whole first close almost, from an institutional investor that jumped board because the management changed, and then all of a sudden
the management of the investor
of the institutional of the institutional investors. So, and then all of a sudden we were sort of out of the priority list, and so that's, I would say, watch out to don't rely too much on one particular big commitment. Diversify a bit your commitment base. That's the key thing, and also to point one, really focus on reading the investors right. There's a lot of people who wouldn't tell you no, so they keep on talking. You have tons of coffees, but it doesn't really get to the finish line.
Doesn't get you anywhere at the end. So on the topic of having an investor who almost had the full amount of the first close, what went exactly wrong? Is it that you just knew the people who were at the top and they left, or is it that the mandate of this investor changed?
So it was the commitment from that particular investor was backed by the management, and I think it was a bit of a new thing for them to do Africa.
Okay.
And so the sponsor of their idea was really it was part of the management. It was not that they had a mandate to invest in Africa. And when this particular person left, and then other team members as well, it fell a little bit off the priority list, and they had other focus areas.
And that was a DFI or a commercial investor?
No, that was a commercial investor.
That was a commercial investor. Any thoughts on maybe legal or mistakes that were done at the setup level? Can you point to that?
Legal also, I think I pointed out to, we tried to do it in Denmark with a fund domicile in Denmark with Danish lawyers, and I think there maybe the mistake was, or the key learning for us was to maybe really think international, because we obviously want to grow internationally, and that's very key. And then I think in the legal environment, it's a very complex world, and there you need to look into the setups from with international lenses. I think that's really key.
So you're referring to your earlier comment on jurisdictions, essentially. That's
exactly.
How you originally were setting up in Denmark, but eventually, when you were talking to local Danish lawyers, they recommended that you set up in Denmark. But eventually, when you spoke to international lawyers, they recommended doing a more international jurisdiction, Mauritius. And okay, I see what you mean. Anything on the investment side that went wrong that you can speak to, or something that you generally recommend to people?
I think what also on the investment side, we also have key learnings. I think, for example, the first deal took longer than anticipated. I would say, and it was a pretty large deal. It would have been an excellent deal together with co-investors. I think there, I would say, make sure that you can start off the ground quickly, and maybe don't start with the most complex deal. So just to start investing just after first loss. I think that's really important. It's sometimes difficult to measure, because sometimes in commercial due diligence you find aspects that makes you say no to a deal. So it's a quite a delicate approach, but I would say make sure that you can invest quickly. For us, it took a bit of time, and of course we are also very, very careful. We didn't want to invest in the first deal, which turns out to be a blow up after a short time. So we were also very, very careful at the beginning and along the way. On the investment side, learnings, I would say, we have worked out a concept that we call the ZP way, which is
the ZP way.
So it's the Zoscales Partners way.
Okay.
Where we really sort of put our learnings into our philosophy, where we learn, for example, also from other funds and maybe other mistakes, that we wanted to have a really concentrated portfolio, only few deals in one fund, because it's a very illiquid market. So we felt that having too many investments in one fund is difficult at the latest at the exit part. We also, that's a common aspect also, but really work with champions, local champions. So that's really, really key. And also to really control the business if possible. So that's the 3 C's we apply. And these are learnings along the way, but there's also learnings from other funds, right? Or advisors or other PE funds in other regions, even other continents. And I think it's doing private equity in an emerging or a frontier market is a constant learning curve. So you constantly learn, and I think it's important to also adjust from learnings. Very, very key.
Very interesting. You pointed the length of time it took you to do your first deal, essentially after you did your first closing. Although it's not unusual, this is very common when you're doing emerging markets, that deals take longer. Typically in the US or even in the UK and EU, these are usually weeks, maybe months at most to go from beginning to end on any given deal. But in emerging markets, whether it's the Middle East or Africa or South America or Southeast Asia, generally these are longer deals, and sometimes you revisit the information a month later and things take a lot longer to close any given deal. And so during that time, obviously, you're dealing with a lot of changes in the market, sometimes with the projections you have there, and then obviously there's the issue of valuations, which is a little bit tough to put together in an emerging market context. How did you deal with markets? Because you, from a valuation perspective, I mean, you're dealing with markets where like Kenya and Ethiopia and Tanzania and Uganda and so on. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, these are the countries that you're investing in, and more broadly East Africa at the moment. Although you may even be doing things a little bit broader than that in the long run. But when you're setting up to do a deal in this kind of environment, your comparables or your discount rates and things like that for valuation are a little bit tricky to build, because there weren't maybe no recent deals that are comparable to the business you're creating. So how do you work around that? Like, do you go for maybe like try to understand who eventually will buy this deal, maybe focus on the exit a little bit more than the valuation and your willingness to pay a certain amount? Tell me a little bit about that, in fact.
So it's a key point. So in an illiquid market for us, where data points are rare or scarce, there's a couple of things that are extremely important. Number one is we can look at comps there are similar deals in similar markets where you have some kind of idea what kind of multiple applies. And also, our team has experience in doing deals on the continent, so they have sort of a reference points. But I think it's really the second point you mentioned with the exit. So when we do a deal, what we always do, because it's a liquid market, we always talk to potential buyers of this particular portfolio company, because the challenge you see in Africa often is that exit takes a lot of time, and I think it mainly takes a lot of time because maybe it takes more time to find the right buyer, or it's a company that is actually people are not interested in buying. So sometimes I refer to in the US or in Europe, when you have a very good business or a very good company, is a good deal. In Africa, that's not necessarily the case. You can have a fantastic deal, a fantastic company, fantastic business, but nobody wants to buy it. So I think that's key to really, what we do is we spend a lot of time talking to potential buyers. So that gives you an indication of interest, that gives you an indication of sometimes even price. We have one particular portfolio company where we exactly know, we know one potential buyer quite well. We know exactly what they would pay for that particular business. So that helps you to sort of value the business at entry. That's key, and I think you should do that not only with one potential buyers, but really talk to different potential buyers. Not only on pricing, it gives you a sort of a proof of your model. It also helps you to sometimes check out the value add you actually planned. It could be that a multinational has another idea. They focus much more on distribution, or to be the number one player in a big city is more important than diversify across the country. So these kind of things are actually quite important, because you can have great ideas, but nobody's interested in them. So to test the price level, to test your strategies is really important.
Great ideas and like great companies, great value add ideas. Yeah. The whole package, but then maybe nobody wants to buy that company ultimately.
Exactly.
That's what you're referring to.
Or you maybe find 3 multinationals that all have the same approach if they came into your particular market and your particular company.
Interesting. And were you talking to multinationals primarily about the potential exits for your potential deals, or were you also talking to maybe the larger funds that could be buying your asset once you've had a chance to grow it?
We try to talk to both, but I think priority number one is multinationals.
Multinationals.
I think that's really
that's
also
in the context of Africa primarily. Yeah, that's what we were.
Yeah. But we obviously also talk to other funds, larger funds that where we could be an obvious that could be an exit route for us. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. I know we spent some time here talking about these very interesting subjects, but I want you to maybe leave us with some final thoughts about what you would have in terms of advice for someone setting up a new fund, particularly in an emerging market. What would you tell them to consider, keep in mind, worry about? Essentially, what can you tell us?
I think to have a strong vision is the number one.
Strong vision.
That's the strong. That's a strong starting point, and I think to make sure that that vision is aligned with your team and the partners you and the advisors you work with. That's really number one. And I think also it's something that you need to do with passion. It needs to be more than just the financial perspective. I think it's really you should burn for that project. That's key, because it's gonna take some time to also make financial returns for yourself. And I think another aspect is also really to make sure that you work a lot on the culture of your team. Find people that actually really want to do that together with you, and then also let them share the success. Make sure that you have a team that actually supports each other and doesn't consist of only individuals that look for their own little successes. And then I think last but not least, it's also do it well-hearted, because sometimes we ask our investors, why do you actually invest in us? It's very interesting, right? We're not a no-brainer firm, so. And it comes down to the people, to be a likable team, to be transparent. I think it's a very, very key aspect as well. To really mean what you tell them, and also to be to care about your investors, to care about the portfolio companies, to care about your team. I think is really, really key. And then last but not least. We in our slogan, we call it "Invest where it matters," and I think that goes back to the vision. We really want to make a difference in difficult markets. We really want to actually, be part of building the ecosystem, create jobs, create better lives for many people. And I think if that is embedded in your DNA, in your heart of building a business, then I think it's a good success driver.
Impact. I mean, clearly, impact is a big element nowadays in a lot of investors' minds, and obviously this is something we didn't touch on. In fact, maybe we could do that next time. I'd love to host you.
I'm very happy to
in Philadelphia on campus at Wharton, if and we can maybe talk a little bit more about that as well.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a topic by itself as well. Yeah. So I want to thank you today for your time, and I'm glad we were able to meet here in Denmark. And
thank you.
After 2 years, I guess we've been thinking about doing this at some point somewhere. Thanks again. I appreciate your time, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, and also looking forward. Thank you.
Take care.